The Thomas Code, Chapter 8. Interlude. 5 and 7 loaves. The miracle of the loaves and fishes, in which Jesus feeds a multitude, is well known even to non-Christians. What is less well known is that there are actually two separate but almost identical miracles. Numbers are very prominent in the story, and the numbers are the only thing that substantially change between the two miracles. In the first miracle, Mark 6:34-45, Jesus divides up 5 loaves and 2 fishes to feed 5,000 with 12 baskets of scraps. Then a little later, Mark 8:1-10, Jesus divides up 7 loaves and a few fishes to feed 4,000 with 7 baskets of scraps. Unusually, the story of the loaves and fishes is included in all 4 Gospels. It is clear that it is the Mark account that is the earliest, and Matthew follows Mark very closely. Matthew 12:13-20, 1 and 15, the 21 and 15, 32-39, with 2 separate miracles. The authors of Luke and John must have been bothered by the oddity of 2 almost identical miracles and streamlined their accounts by keeping only the first and more impressive miracle, Luke 9:10-17, and John 6:1-15. If we look at the 2 miracles in the earliest version, that of Mark, we will see that they both start with Jesus showing compassion for the people, and they both end with Jesus making a boat journey across the Sea of Galilee. So why does the author of Mark include what seems to be the same miracle twice? Did he have 2 slightly different accounts of a real event that happened in Galilee? But what is odd is how specific the numbers are, and how they differ between the 2 versions. If we had 2 memories of an actual event, we would not have expected them to stress the numbers in this way. The numbers must mean something. The real clincher for rejecting the idea that there were 2 separate versions of the same story is that the 2 are brought together in Mark. When Jesus and his disciples are in a boat after the second miracle, Jesus warns his disciples to beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod. His disciples are confused and begin to discuss among themselves their lack of bread. Jesus, hearing them, upbraids them and asks if they have eyes to see and ears to hear. He then poses a conundrum. When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, Do you not yet understand? Mark 8:19-21. Many people have wondered if this is a mathematical puzzle. It seems that Jesus is challenging his disciples and us to solve something. If so, then both versions of the miracle must be involved in the solution. We should not consider them in isolation, but as 2 halves of a greater whole. And this provides the answer as to why the author of Mark includes the miracle twice. He does not have 2 separate sources, but one source which includes both versions and the summary. So he concludes that there must have been 2 very similar miracles, and incorporates both into his narrative. We can feel some sympathy for the disciples, rebuked for their inability to understand an apparently insoluble problem. But we are in a more fortunate position. We have the key to the mathematical mystery that Jesus is propounding, the Thomas Code, the feeding of the 5,000. We will start with the first miracle, that of the feeding of the 5,000. Here it is in full. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But he answered them, You give them something to eat. And they said to him, Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? And he said to them, How many loaves do you have? And he said to them, How many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups, by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. Mark 6:34-45. An obvious clue here is the number of loaves and fishes, 5 and 2. The Thomas code is a play on the 3 prime numbers 2, 3, and 5. We have 2 of them here, and we have seen how the combination of 2 and 5 represent the other number 3, the number of the Father. What first led me to the miracle, though, was what it says about organizing the multitude. So they sat down in groups, by hundreds and by 50s. One problem with the idea that Thomas was structured as a hierarchy was the lack of any other examples of such an organizing principle in ancient texts. How could I be sure that early Christians could think in this way? To my amazement, I found what I was looking for in the way the 5,000 sat down in groups. So, how is it possible to arrange 5,000 people by hundreds and 50s? Do we have some groups of 50 and some of 100? No, because we should note that 5,000 equals 50 multiplied by 100. In fact, we can go further than this because 100 equals 2 times 50. So, 5,000 equals 50 multiplied by 2 multiplied by 50. But this is the same type of symmetrical factorization as we find in the Thomas code. And just as we can generate a hierarchical ordering from the Thomas code, so we can generate an equivalent ordering from the above formula. First, we must group people in 50s. Then we combine pairs of 50s to make groups of hundreds. This is what is meant by grouping by hundreds and 50s. The groupings of 50s and hundreds apply simultaneously, just as the groupings into multiple levels apply in Thomas. And just like Thomas, we can reverse the process by dividing the whole into 50 groups, and then 100 groups, so we can write the grouping in this way. 5,000 groups of 1 person. 100 groups of 50 people. 50 groups of 100 people. 1 group of 5,000 people. Compare this to the Thomas grouping. 108 groups of 1 saying. 36 groups of 3 sayings. 18 groups of 6 sayings. 6 groups of 18 sayings. 3 groups of 36 sayings. 1 group of 108 sayings. The Thomas code has more levels, but the organizing principle being used is the same, completing the prime factorization. The above factorization of 5,000 is not complete because 50 is not a prime number. To go further and compare the sequence with the Thomas code, we need to continue the factorization until it only consists of prime numbers. To do this, we must split 50 into primes. 50 equals 2 multiplied by 5 squared. As the Thomas code is an ordered prime factorization, we need to put the factors in order. We already have part of this order from the following formula. 5,000 equals 50 times 2 times 50. We can also write the factorization of 50 in a way that looks very similar. 50 equals 5 multiplied by 2 multiplied by 5. Substituting this into the formula for 5,000 gives the complete ordered prime factorization as shown here. 5 loaves and 2 fishes. To feed the 5,000, Jesus splits 5 loaves and 2 fishes. This is clearly a reference to the prime factorization into 5s and 2s. It shows us that we are on the right track. We've already seen the significance of the 5s and 2s in indicating the number of the Father, 3. Thomas code and 5,000 sequency. If we place the Thomas code alongside the 5,000 sequence, we can see the similarity. Both sequences consist of two prime numbers. The number of factors in the sequence is equal to the next highest prime number, 5 or 7. If we add the two prime numbers, we get the number of factors. 3 plus 2 equals 5 factors. 5 plus 2 equals 7 factors. If we add any two consecutive numbers, we also get the number of factors. We have seen how the Thomas sayings draw attention to precisely these features of the Thomas code, which are also true of the 5,000 sequence. In fact, there is a family of series with these properties, all of which must involve 2 as one of the prime factors. The first 3 members of this family are shown here. The next sequence, with 2 and 17, would have 19 factors and would be an extremely large number. Sequences getting totals of 1 billion or more are going to have little interest to the mystics of the Jesus movement. So we are left with basically just the first 2. We could also switch the order of the factors, giving us these sequences of numbers. But this would involve having more occurrences of the lower factor than the higher. The probability that by chance we should hit upon a sequence with the same properties as the Thomas code is vanishingly small. It reduces to 0 when we consider the clues supplied in the story, the hierarchy for arranging the multitude, and the 2 prime factors in the number of fish and loaves. We have not explained everything yet about the first miracle. There is still the 12 basket of scraps. But to understand this feature, we need to look at the second miracle. The second miracle. This is the second miracle. In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered, and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from far away. And his disciples answered him, How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? And he asked them, How many loaves do you have? They said, 7. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied, and they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full, and there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away. And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. Mark 8, 1-10. A few small fish. All the numbers in the miracles of the loaves and fishes are very precise with one exception. In the second miracle there are a few small fish. This vagueness indicates that the detail of the fish has been added by the author of Mark to make the story consistent with the first miracle. There are a couple of clues that support this. When Jesus asks his disciples how many loaves they have, the disciples include 2 fish in their reply in the first miracle, but do not mention fish in the second miracle. The scraps collected include fish in the first miracle, but fish are not mentioned in the second. A more literal translation of the Greek is that in the first miracle the baskets are full of fragments and also of the fish, but in the second miracle they have just fragments. We can conclude that the source did not mention fish in the second miracle, but only had loaves. This is important because the first miracle was the expansion of the 2 primes 2 and 5. In the second miracle, we are only given one number, 7. Nor do we have the detail of grouping the multitude. So although the 2 miracles sound very similar, we cannot simply repeat the pattern of the first but must now do something completely different. So how, starting with 7 loaves, can we feed the 4,000? Perhaps we should look to the summary that brings the elements of the 2 miracles together, for they must be solved as a whole. After the second miracle, Jesus crosses the lake and has a brief argument with the Pharisees who ask for a sign, before getting into a boat again. He then gives his disciples the following summary. Now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, Watch out. Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, Do you not yet understand? Mark 8:14-21. We should ignore the novelistic details the author of Mark has added to flesh out the story, such as the disciples not having enough bread. The detail that they had 1 loaf recalls the single one, indicating the chosen disciples. Jesus repeats most of the numbers in the 2 miracles, although missing out fish. We can represent the 2 miracles and the summary in the diagram. 5 and 7 loaves. We have seen that the sequence encoded by the miracle of the 5,000 is the second in a series starting with the Thomas Code. The other members of this series have too many factors and multiply out to too large a value to be of interest to the Jesus movement. So, if the first miracle encodes the 7-factor sequence, then we should expect the second miracle to encode the 5-factor sequence of the Thomas Code. However, we know that the Thomas Code value is 108 and not 4,000. So we are looking for something that is parallel to the Thomas Code, but not identical. Now we have 2 sequences, one with 5 factors and one with 7 factors. In the 2 miracles, we have 5 loaves and 7 loaves with the numbers emphasized in both the summary and in Jesus' questions to the disciples. So it makes sense that the loaves represent the number of factors in the sequence. The first miracle with 5 loaves constructs the sequence of 7 factors, so the second miracle with 7 loaves should construct the 5-factor sequence. The 5 loaves in the first miracle do double duty because they also represent one of the 2 prime factors. This is because the number 5 is both the number of factors in the Thomas Code, and one of the prime factors in the Thomas Code, and one of the prime factors in the 5,000 sequence. From 7 loaves to 5. The second miracle starts with 7 loaves, which must represent the 7-factor sequence. We now need to get from these 7 loaves to a 5-loaf sequence, feeding the 4,000. Our starting point then is the 5,000 sequence, 5252, 525. From this, we must generate 5 loaves, a sequence of 5 factors. Fragments. There is one prominent feature of the story that we have not so far considered, the baskets of fragments, klasmata, or broken pieces. There are 12 baskets of fragments in the first miracle and 7 baskets in the second miracle. Clearly, the numbers must be significant. So what is a fragment? In mathematical terms, we might ordinarily think of it as a remainder. However, we are working with sequences of prime factorizations. This suggests the idea that the fragment represents a subsequence. We have seen how such subsequences are important in the Thomas sayings. For example, the stones that minister in 1.18 refer to the central subsequence, 2, 3, 2. If fragments are subsequences, then we must break off some subsequences from our 7 loaves to make the new 5 loaves. We are trying to create something similar to the Thomas Code, 3, 2, 3, 2, 3. So we need a subsequence that represents the 3 and another that represents the 2. Let us now look for these. 3 threes. The threes occupy the beginning, middle, and end of the Thomas code. Can we find 3 threes in the same positions in our 7 loaves code? We can. Two twos. In the Thomas code, the 2s occupy positions similar to the 2 fillings in a double-decker sandwich. 3, 2, 3, 2, 3. We can find 2 sequences of 2 factors positioned in this way in the 7 loaves, as shown here. Our 2 subsequences are not identical but are mirror images of each other, giving the same value. So we must break off these 2 fragments of 2 multiplied by 5 and 5 multiplied by 2. The number of baskets. The number of baskets of fragments is 12 and 7. We can equate these to the subsequences representing 3 and 2 if we add the factors in each subsequence shown here. The numbers in our fragments add up to the right number of baskets. This shows we are on the right track. 5 loaves. We can now put together our 5 loaves from the fragments we have broken off the 7 loaves, as displayed here. This is complex and unattractive, which is a sign that we are not quite there yet. If we were to multiply out the sequence as it stands, we would get the following answer. There are 3 problems with this. We have 13 factors and not 5. The 2 prime numbers do not alternate as we would expect. We have too many factors of 5. The value of the sequence, 12.5 million, is far too high. The sequence is not right yet. We are not finished baking our loaves. The yeast of the Pharisees and Herod. We must turn to another clue in the account of the 2 miracles. When Jesus is in the boat after the second miracle, he gives this warning. Watch out. Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. We have assembled 5 loaves from the fragments of the 7 as shown. The role of yeast is to make loaves of bread swell up, and our loaves are too big. So we must take out the yeast put into the loaves by those malign forces, the Pharisees and Heresies and Herod. The Gospel of Matthew interprets the yeast as being the teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees, but this cannot be right. The author of Matthew is forced to substitute the Sadducees for Herod to support this interpretation because Herod did not have any teachings. In any case, the yeast must be a number, because Jesus gives us a numerical calculation. When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. So the yeast is given by the numbers 12 and 7. We have seen that these are the sums of the factors in our loaves. But we are now looking for a factor or factors to eliminate from the loaves. If we multiply out the values of the loaves, we get 5 times 2 times 5 equals 50. And 2 times 5 equals 10. So we are looking for something that divides 50 or 10. These are the possibilities. We might try and use both 12 and 7 as the yeast. This does not work because neither 10 or 50 is divisible by either 12 or 7. If we were to multiply 12 and 7, we would get 84, which is not correct because it is larger than any of our leaves. We cannot divide 7 and 12 or 12 into 7. If we were to add 12 and 7, we get 19, which does not divide either 10 or 50. There is only one option left. We must subtract one number from the other. 12 minus 7 equals 5. This works very well because 5 is a factor in all of our loaves. So, yeast equals 5. This conclusion is supported by the fact that the word for yeast, zymes, has 5 letters. Feeding the 4,000. We can now remove the yeast by eliminating one of the 5s from each one of the loaves, as shown here. This is now much better. First, there are 2 2s in the correct place. Then, we have the factors 2 and 5 in the same place as 3s in the Thomas code. As we have seen, the factors 2 times 5 equals 10 are alternatives to 3 because 2 and 5 are the only prime numbers whose difference equals 3. If we write the sequence with 10 instead of 2 times 5, then we get an alternative version of the Thomas code. This is equivalent to the Thomas code as both 10 and 3 stand for the Father. If we multiply it out, we get 10 times 2 times 10 times 2 times 10, which equals 4,000. The above shows that, starting with the 7 loaves, we have fed the 4,000, Jesus, and the fish. The fish is, of course, a well-known symbol for Jesus. It dates from the earliest years of the Jesus movement and has been found in the catacombs of Rome. Yet nowhere in the New Testament is Jesus called a fish. When Jesus appoints Simon and Andrew as his disciples and says that he will make them fishers of men. But this implies that it is the potential converts who are fish and not Jesus. However, in the miracle of the feeding 5,000, the 2 fishes represent the number 2, the number which is Jesus. Jesus breaks the bread and gives it to the disciples, and then he takes the 2 fish, and he divided the 2 fish among them all. Mark 6:41. The bread is a symbol for the spiritual substance of Jesus, as in the Eucharist. This is the only place in which the fish is also a symbol for Jesus. The miracle is describing the sequence of 7, but this is also an allusion to the Thomas sequence, where the 2 2s are divided on each side of the 3, 3, 2, 3, 2, 3. The numeric symbolism explains why Jesus should be represented by the sign of the fish, just as it explains how the concept of the Trinity arose,